A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hello there, Herman and Corn. I'd love to chat today about one of those terms we've had in many of our episodes, and which I have to quietly admit, or publicly in this case, that I've actually no idea what it means. I'm talking about neoliberalism, and we've mentioned it in our discussions around capitalism and how we can envision, or what a post-capitalist economy might actually look like, thinking beyond approaches like ESG and impact investment to more radical rethinks and reshifts in how our political the very fabric of our society can be governed, and how we can move away from ascribing all value in purely economic terms, with currency being the ultimate arbiter of value. And that was an episode that I'm going to need to listen back to again because it was very information dense. And sometimes I have to say this podcast is so information dense, which is a good thing, that after a few episodes my brain is just kind of soaked, and I need to just listen to music for a while, or be old-fashioned and talk to a human. We still do that now and again. Neoliberalism is, as I mentioned, what I'd like to talk about in this episode. And I asked our dear colleague at ChatGPT to give me just a quick intro. And before reading its notes, what I guess confuses me about this idea is, for me, our political system and our economic system are kind of two different things. We have the people that direct our economy or shape how our economy is set up, and we have our politicians, the lawmakers, who are concerned with passing laws. But really, that's not the case. There's a huge amount of attachment between these two enterprises. Neoliberalism is a political and economic philosophy that favors free markets, limited government intervention in the economy, and the expansion of private enterprise. It emerged in the mid-20th century, particularly in response to post-World War II welfare states and Keynesian economic policies. It became influential in the 70s and 80s through leaders such as Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US. Core principles: free markets, privatization, deregulation, free trade and globalization, and reduced public spending, particularly on social welfare programs in favor of fiscal restraint and balanced budgets. So what I find interesting about this list of features is that, you guys know that I'm a techie, so I'm kind of just imagining it as a spec sheet here. The spec sheet for neoliberalism is not more government or less government. If you want more government, we're going to be ramping up government intervention across all domains, which doesn't really square with just about anything here, free markets and public spending. We want it to be involved in everything. It's more like minimize the role of government. We're saying privatize, deregulate, but also don't get involved in the charitable or supportive aspect of government. And I think that what we've seen here in Israel is an interesting point of contrast. We've seen Israel go from a poor country, an agrarian economy, to a very wealthy country very quickly, but also a wealthy country with massive income inequality. And I think that that's been a very, very divisive and unhealthy thing. But one of the few long-term trends that I think Israel has done well is it's preserved some concept of the welfare state, or some concept of basic social support in the form of the mandatory health funds we have here. So there's at least a sort of a buffer, saving people between what they can afford to pay and total devastation as human beings. Sadly, that doesn't extend very significantly in the realm of rent or tenancy, shelter, I should say, if we're talking about human needs, but there's at least some kind of a buffer. So I don't think it really squares with this approach entirely, or maybe it does. Maybe that is what a minimized public spending infrastructure actually looks like. But Herman and Corn, I'd love to go into the details a bit more. When we're talking about neoliberalism, are we talking about, where does that kind of reduced public spending? That word reduced is what's a bit nebulous to me. and what I'd love to talk about. We're not talking about a complete decimation of the role of government in providing those support services, but we are talking about a significant contraction. And where does that division exactly lie? Because I presume there's another school of thought that says governments are there to preserve law and order, and that's it. Minimal, absolute minimal across the board, including in the provision of anything resembling social services and support. Besides those questions, where has neoliberalism been tried? Where would you say it flourishes the most today if you were to point to a country? And where does it sit against the other approaches that we see, particularly today, and not just the Israeli context, because most of our listeners, I now know from our show analytics, are actually based in other countries. For those curious about yesterday, I did the first analytics run with data, 12,000 listens across the last 7 days, which is really encouraging, I must say, and actually really interesting to get the geographical breakdown. 70% in the US, Ireland, Spain, Germany, some countries I really didn't expect, and Israel, actually fairly about number 8. So hey, it's not just me listening to my own show. That's kind of cool. So Herman and Quern, let's keep global context, although I think Israel is still a good illustrative case study in our discussion today about neoliberalism.
You know, it is funny how certain words just become part of the background noise of our lives. We hear them in news reports, read them in op-eds, and even use them ourselves without always having a rock-solid grasp on the actual machinery behind them. Today, we are diving into one of those heavy hitters. Today's prompt from Daniel is about neoliberalism. It is a term that has come up a lot in our previous chats about post-capitalist economies and the future of work. But Daniel pointed out that he has never really felt like he understood the nuts and bolts of it. He feels like it is used as a shorthand for everything people hate about the modern world, but he wants to know what the actual blueprint looks like.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I am actually really glad Daniel sent this one in. It is one of those concepts that is often used as a catch-all insult or a vague praise, but it has a very specific history and a very specific set of internal logics. It is not just a synonym for capitalism. It is more like a specific flavor or a specific operating system for how a society functions. Daniel mentioned that he thinks of his political and economic systems as separate things, but the core of neoliberalism is that it tries to make them one and the same by applying market logic to everything, including politics and personal life. It is the idea that the market is not just a place where you buy apples. It is the most efficient and moral way to organize all human activity.
That is a great starting point. Daniel used the idea of a spec sheet, which I think is a helpful way to look at it. If we were looking at the spec sheet for a neoliberal economy, we would see things like privatization, deregulation, and free trade. But the one that really caught Daniel's eye, and the one I want us to spend some time on, is reduced public spending. He asked a really important question. Where does that line actually fall? Is it a total gutting of the state? Or is there a floor where the government still steps in?
That is the million-dollar question, Korn. To understand where that line is, we have to look at what the neoliberal thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman actually wanted. We have to go back to the 1930s and 1940s. After the Great Depression and during World War II, the world was moving toward heavy government intervention. You had the New Deal in the United States and the rise of central planning in Europe. A group of scholars met at the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947 because they were terrified that any government planning would inevitably lead to totalitarianism. They were not necessarily anarchists. They did not want zero government. What they wanted was what they called a night watchman state. In that model, the government exists primarily to protect property rights, enforce contracts, and maintain a military for national defense. Anything beyond that, like running a post office or a rail network or even providing health care, is seen as an inefficiency that the market could handle better.
So, in that strict interpretation, the line is drawn right at the edge of law and order. But we know that is not how it usually plays out in reality. Even the most neoliberal countries we see today still have some form of public education or basic infrastructure. Is that because the theory is flexible? Or is it because pure neoliberalism is just impossible to implement without a total societal collapse?
It is a bit of both. In practice, neoliberalism is less about the total absence of the state and more about the state acting as a facilitator for the market. Think of it like the economic thermostat we discussed back in episode 518. The state does not decide what the temperature should be, but it makes sure the machinery is running so the market can find its own equilibrium. When a neoliberal government reduces public spending, they are not just trying to save money. They are trying to remove the state from the equation so that private competition can take over. The idea is that if the government provides a service, there is no incentive to innovate or lower costs. If you privatize it, the profit motive supposedly drives efficiency. The line for public spending usually falls at the point where a service can be turned into a commodity. If you can sell it, the government shouldn't be giving it away.
But that leads us directly to the tension Daniel mentioned regarding Israel and Ireland. He pointed out that Israel has moved from a very socialist, agrarian roots to a high-tech powerhouse with massive income inequality. Yet, it still has these mandatory health funds that provide a base level of care for everyone. That seems to contradict the pure neoliberal spec sheet. If you are reducing public spending, why keep a universal healthcare system?
That is where the nuance comes in. Neoliberalism often coexists with existing social structures, sometimes because it has to for political survival. In Israel, the health funds are actually a great example of what some call embedded neoliberalism. Yes, the state mandates that you have insurance, but the funds themselves compete with each other. They operate with a certain level of market logic even though they are part of a national system. The line for public spending often gets drawn at the point of market failure. A neoliberal might argue that if the market literally cannot provide a basic necessity like emergency medicine or primary education without leaving half the population behind, the state can step in, but it should do so in a way that mimics a market. Think of school vouchers instead of just funding public schools directly. The state provides the money, but the individual acts as a consumer in a marketplace of schools. It is about transforming the citizen into a customer.
That shift from citizen to consumer is a huge part of this, right? It changes the entire relationship between the individual and the state. If I am a consumer of government services, my value is tied to my ability to participate in the market. This connects back to our discussion in episode 448 about the freelancer's dilemma. In a neoliberal framework, you are essentially your own little corporation. You are responsible for your own training, your own healthcare, and your own retirement. The state's role in the safety net is reduced because the expectation is that the market will provide those things if you are a productive participant. It is the ultimate do you philosophy, but with very high stakes if you fail.
And that is why the reduced public spending part is so controversial. When you cut funding for social programs, you are effectively saying that the market is a more moral and efficient judge of who deserves what than a group of bureaucrats or voters. The flourish of neoliberalism usually happens in places where there is a strong desire to attract international capital. Ireland is the poster child for this. Starting in the late 1980s and exploding in the 1990s with the Celtic Tiger, Ireland embraced a very specific neoliberal path. By lowering corporate taxes to 12.5% and deregulating parts of the economy, they made themselves a hub for global tech and pharma companies. On paper, their gross domestic product exploded. But as Daniel mentioned, the gap between that market value and human well-being can get pretty wide. We talked about that disconnect in episode 852. In Ireland today, you have massive multinational profits coexisting with a severe housing crisis and underfunded public infrastructure. The market is thriving, but the public square is struggling.
I want to dig into where this is actually flourishing today. We mentioned Ireland and Israel, but what about the United States or the United Kingdom? Those are the places where the Reagan and Thatcher revolution started. Are they still the primary examples, or has the world moved on to something else?
The United States and the United Kingdom are still very much in the neoliberal orbit, but it has become so normalized there that people often do not even realize it is a specific choice. It is just the water they swim in. When you hear politicians talk about running the government like a business, that is neoliberalism. When you see public-private partnerships for building bridges or running prisons, that is neoliberalism. But if you want to see where it is being pushed to its limits today, you might look at places like Singapore or even parts of Eastern Europe that did a shock therapy transition after the fall of the Soviet Union. In those Eastern European cases, they moved from total state control to almost total market control in a matter of years. It was a brutal transition that created a lot of wealth for a few and a lot of instability for many.
Singapore is an interesting case because it has a very strong interventionist government in some ways, but it is also one of the most free market economies in the world. How does that fit into the neoliberal definition?
Singapore is what some scholars call a developmental state with neoliberal characteristics. The government is very involved in long-term planning, but they use market mechanisms to achieve their goals. They have a very low tax environment, and they run their state-owned enterprises like private corporations. They are obsessed with efficiency and global competitiveness. It shows that the limited government intervention part of the definition can be a bit of a misnomer. Sometimes a neoliberal state is actually very active, but its activity is focused entirely on making the market work better rather than providing social welfare for its own sake. They will spend billions on a port or a fiber optic network, but they will be very hesitant to spend on a generous unemployment benefit that might discourage people from working.
So, it is more about the goal of the intervention than the amount of intervention itself. If the government spends money to build a port that helps private companies export goods, that is fine. But if it spends money to provide universal basic income, that is seen as a distortion of the market. Speaking of which, how does this compare to the other contemporary approaches? We have mentioned social democracy in the past, like the Nordic model. How does a place like Denmark draw that line differently than a neoliberal state?
The Nordic model, or social democracy, starts from a different premise. They believe that the market is a great tool for creating wealth, but it is a terrible tool for distributing it fairly or providing social stability. So, instead of trying to make everything look like a market, they use high taxes to fund a very robust public sector. The line for public spending there is much higher. They see things like healthcare, education, and even high-quality childcare as rights of citizenship, not products to be consumed. The state acts as a buffer between the individual and the fluctuations of the market. In a neoliberal system, you are exposed to the market. In a social democratic system, you are insulated from it. If you lose your job in Denmark, the state provides a very high level of support while you retrain. In a neoliberal system, losing your job is a market signal that your skills are no longer valuable, and the burden of fixing that is entirely on you.
And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is state capitalism, like what we see in China. In that model, the state does not just facilitate the market, it owns the most important parts of it. The government uses the market to achieve national goals, but the ultimate authority is the state, not the price signal. It is almost the inverse of neoliberalism. Instead of the market consuming the state consumes the market.
That is a perfect way to put it, and it is why the debate is so heated right now. For several decades, from the 1980s until the global financial crisis in 2008, the neoliberal approach was the only game in town. It was called the Washington Consensus. If a country wanted a loan from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, they had to adopt neoliberal policies, privatize, deregulate, and cut spending. It was treated like a universal law of physics. But after 2008, and especially after the pandemic, people started to realize that the market is not always great at handling big systemic shocks.
Right, because the market is focused on short-term efficiency, not long-term resilience. If you have a lean, just-in-time supply chain because it is the most profitable way to run things, you are in big trouble when a global event shuts down a major port. A neoliberal system might save you money in the good times, but it can leave you very vulnerable in the bad times. This is something we touched on in episode 639, when we talked about the future of survival and the potential need for a universal basic income, as artificial intelligence starts to disrupt the labor market. A pure neoliberal approach would say that if your job is replaced by an artificial intelligence agent, you just need to retrain and find a new way to be productive in the market. But what if there are no jobs left that the market values more than an artificial intelligence?
That is the breaking point. Neoliberalism relies on the idea that everyone can be an entrepreneur of themselves. It assumes that there is always a market for human effort if the price is right. But if the market value of human labor drops towards zero in certain sectors because of automation, the whole system starts to wobble. This is why we are seeing a bit of a retreat from neoliberalism in some places. As of early 2026, you see governments talking more about industrial policy again. This is a huge shift. Industrial policy is a fancy way of saying the government is picking winners and losers to ensure national security or achieve climate goals. That is a direct rejection of the idea that the market always knows best. When the United States passes something like the CHIPS Act to subsidize domestic semiconductor manufacturing, that is a post-neoliberal move. It is the state saying, we cannot leave this to the market because the market might choose to build everything in a place that is strategically risky.
I want to go back to Daniel's specific interest in the reduced public spending line. If a listener is living in a country that is leaning heavily into neoliberalism, what does that actually look like for them on a day-to-day basis? Beyond just the big macro terms, how does it change their life?
It shows up in the small things. It is the fact that your local library has shorter hours because its budget was cut. It is the fact that your commute takes longer because the public transit system is underfunded and the government is trying to find a private contractor to take it over. It is the rising cost of university tuition because the state has shifted the burden of payment from the taxpayer to the individual student. The idea is that you're the one getting the degree, so you should be the one to pay for it as an investment in your own human capital. It turns every life choice into a financial calculation. You are not just choosing a career, you are managing a portfolio where the asset is yourself.
It also affects the physical environment. We talked about this in episode 572 regarding zoning and policy. In a neoliberal framework, land is often seen primarily as an asset for investment, rather than a place for people to live. If the goal of the state is to maximize market value, they might prioritize luxury high-rises over affordable housing because the market signal for luxury units is stronger. The reduced public spending means there is less money for public housing, or for creating the kind of non-commercial spaces that make a city livable. You end up with cities that are very efficient at generating wealth, but very difficult to actually live in if you are not part of the high-earning class.
And it creates a very specific kind of anxiety. If the safety net is thin and the line for public support is very low, you are always one bad break away from disaster. That is the freelancer's dilemma we discussed. Without a collective cushion, the pressure to always be productive, always be networking, and always be upgrading your skills is immense. It is a very high-stakes way to live. Some people thrive in it, especially those with the resources to navigate the market effectively. But for a lot of people, it leads to burnout and a sense of alienation. You start to feel like you are only as valuable as your last paycheck.
So, if we look at the comparison Daniel asked for, where does neoliberalism stand against something like the New Green Deal or the ideas around a post-capitalist economy?
Neoliberalism is essentially the status quo that those movements are pushing against. A Green New Deal, for example, requires massive public spending and a huge amount of government intervention in the economy to transition away from fossil fuels. It is the opposite of limited government. It says that some goals, like the survival of the planet, are more important than market efficiency. Post-capitalist ideas go even further, suggesting that we should move away from the price signal as the primary way we organize society altogether. They argue that neoliberalism has reached its logical conclusion, and that we need a new operating system that prioritizes human and ecological well-being over capital accumulation.
It is interesting because even within neoliberalism, there is a debate about whether it has failed, or if it just hasn't been tried hard enough. Some true believers would argue that the problems we see, like income inequality or crumbling infrastructure, are not because of the market, but because the government is still meddling too much. They would say the line for public spending isn't low enough yet. They might point to things like occupational licensing or remaining trade barriers as the real culprits.
Right. The old, it is not a bug, it is a feature argument. They might say that inequality is actually a good thing because it provides the incentive for people to work harder and innovate. But I think most people are starting to see the limits of that logic. When the top 1% owns as much wealth as the bottom 50%, the social fabric starts to tear. You get the kind of political polarization and populism we are seeing in so many countries today. People feel like the system is rigged against them. And in a neoliberal system where the state's role is to protect property in the market, it can certainly feel that way if you do not have any property or any leverage in the market. If the state's primary job is to enforce contracts, and the contracts are all written by people with more power than you, the state starts to look like an adversary rather than a protector.
Daniel also asked where it flourishes most today. We talked about the geographic locations, but I think it also flourishes in certain sectors. The tech industry is a huge bastion of neoliberal thought. The idea of the disruptor who ignores regulations to bring a new product to market is very much in line with the neoliberal ideal. Think of the early days of ride-sharing or the current Wild West of crypto and artificial intelligence development. These industries often move faster than the state can regulate, creating their own private ecosystems.
That is a great point. Silicon Valley is almost a sovereign state of neoliberalism in some ways. They have their own internal logic that often bypasses traditional government oversight. And because they provide the platforms where we do our communicating, our shopping, and our working, we are all participating in their market-driven world whether we want to or not. It is a form of digital neoliberalism that is even more pervasive than the old school version. In the digital world, the market doesn't just influence your choices, it designs the environment in which you make them. Algorithms are the new invisible hand, but they are programmed by private corporations with very specific profit motives.
So, what are the practical takeaways for someone listening to this? If you are living in a neoliberal or neoliberal-leaning society, what should you be looking out for? How do you spot the spec sheet in action?
First, be aware of the language. When you hear terms like efficiency, optimization, or stakeholder value, ask yourself who is actually benefiting. Is it the public or is it the market? When a politician says we need to tighten our belts, ask whose belt is being tightened. Second, look at the services you rely on. If they are being privatized or if their budgets are being cut in the name of fiscal responsibility, think about what that means for the long-term accessibility of those services. Is a private toll road really better than a public highway if it means half the population can no longer afford to drive to work? And third, realize that the current system is a choice, not a law of nature. Neoliberalism was a very successful intellectual project that took decades to become the dominant worldview. It was built by people with a specific set of ideas, and it can be changed by people with a different set of ideas.
I think it is also important to look at the communities that are trying to build alternatives. Whether it is a local cooperative, a community land trust, or just a group of people coming together to provide a service for free outside of the market, those are small-scale rejections of neoliberal logic. They show that we can still value things that do not have a price tag. They prove that we are capable of organizing ourselves based on mutual aid and shared needs, rather than just competition and profit.
And that brings us back to Daniel's point about the mandatory health funds in Israel. Even in a system that has embraced a lot of neoliberal ideas, there are still these holdouts of collective care. They are a reminder that society is more than just a marketplace. We are neighbors, we are citizens, and in our case, we are brothers. Those relationships don't fit on a neoliberal spec sheet. You can't optimize a friendship, and you can't deregulate a family. Those are the things that actually make life worth living, and they are the things that neoliberalism often struggles to account for.
That is a perfect way to wrap this up. Neoliberalism is a powerful tool for certain things, like generating rapid growth in specific sectors or increasing the variety of consumer goods available to us. But it is a very narrow lens through which to view the world. If you only look at the spec sheet, you miss the human element. You miss the importance of stability, dignity, and community. Daniel, thank you for sending this in. It really forced us to look at the foundations of so many of the topics we talk about on this show. It is the invisible architecture of our modern lives.
Yeah, it was a great deep dive. It is easy to get lost in the technicalities of trade agreements and tax codes, but at the end of the day, it is about how we want to live together. Do we want to be a society of competitors or a community of citizens? If you want to dig deeper into some of the specific examples we mentioned, episode 448 on the freelancer's dilemma is a great companion. Listen to this one. It really brings the macroeconomic theory down to the individual level and looks at the psychological toll of being your own brand.
Definitely. And hey, if you are enjoying our deep dives into these weird prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation. We love seeing the community grow, and we love hearing your thoughts on these complex topics.
It really does. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including the ones we referenced today, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, plus an RSS feed for subscribers and a contact form if you want to send us a prompt of your own. You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We read every single one, even if we can't get to them all on air.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you get your audio fix. Our show music was generated with Suno, which is its own kind of weird tech prompt if you think about it. It is a perfect example of the market providing a service that used to require a whole team of human musicians.
Ha, very true. The market never sleeps, Corn. All right, I think that is it for today. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We will talk to you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep